we ready? It was writer and war veteran Ernest Hemingway who famously said, "War is the best subject of all." So recently, my college journalism students set out to interview 3 World War II veterans. The task seemed fairly simple: ask 3 older gentlemen in their 80s to share a few war stories. But what my students heard would change them forever. Leonard Block was probably like most young men his age in 1941, the year America entered World War II.
If you could say your name, rank, and platoon, please.
My name, rank, and platoon. My name is Leonard Block. It's the same name I had in 1944. I was in I Company, 345th Regiment of the 3rd Battalion of the United States Army. Right. And then they sent me to Fort Jackson, South Carolina, to join the 87th Infantry Division. And the 87th Infantry Division was mostly made up of Oklahoma National Guard men who'd been brought into duty. And to give you some idea of that, being that aside from 2 other men in the company, I was the only college-trained guy. I had 2 years of college at that point. But I stayed with the company and ultimately shipped overseas with them, and this is my notes just to remember all this. On October 1944, I'm reading from this, it's left Fort Jackson, South Carolina by rail for the port of embarkation, which was in New York Harbor, and we boarded the Queen Elizabeth, the original Queen Elizabeth, and went overseas with that. It was a terrible trip.
So I've heard. What was that like?
I was seasick for 7 days. I was so seasick I kept hoping we'd be torpedoed so that I could get off that boat. But we landed in Scotland, spent a month in a little town in Staffordshire, England called Leek. Now, December of 1944, I think I can reconstruct it. The Germans were on the retreat, but they believed that if they moved up through Belgium and Luxembourg and got to Antwerp, they could split the American and British lines, and they put all their effort into what was called now the Battle of the Bulge. And it was nearly successful, and it was really only because of the heroic action of a number of troops in holding them from breaking through, because, if I have this right, there was one road that went from Luxembourg up to Antwerp, and that had to go through the area of the Ardennes forest and the towns that have become popular in legend as Bastogne and Saint-Aubert. And it wasn't just that they were there on the only road, and the Germans could not move their tanks up the road. And that was a turning point in the Battle of the Bulge. All sorts of movies have been made on this, and my company was in a town called Saint-Aubert, which was adjacent to Bastogne. It was parallel to it, and it blocked off the road. So that was really the first serious action that we saw. My feeling at the time, which grew, is that we were crossing a huge field. Oh, I don't know, the size of the field in front of the soccer team here. And the Germans thought to shell us with the 88s. The 88s were the gun that they could lower instead of just firing to shoot a plane out of the sky, they could lower the trajectory and could fire horizontally. It was a devastating weapon, and it was the first time that I saw serious action, men being killed around me. And my job at that time was the company runner. There were the communications between the company and the battalion, and the regiment were all done physically by soldiers. We didn't have cell phones. The communication had to be intensified by running wires. In other words, if you wanted to talk to someone around the corner, you had to literally run a wire to those two extremes. And when we were pinned down in that action, and this is the crux of my war story, someone yelled out, "Runner." And I had taken cover behind a tree or in a depression in the ground. And I remember the feeling of saying, this is ridiculous. You can get killed here. And people, it sounds like a bad joke, but people were being killed. And I saw our first sergeant was killed right in front of me. And a guy named Gregory, he was an old man. He was 30 years old. I mean, different world. And I saw the first cases, which I later learned was conversion hysteria, which, do you know what that is?
No, explain that.
It's when trauma gets so severe that the body shuts itself down. And usually it's done something physically. And a couple of our guys developed blindness. They became literally blind. And it was their defense against what was going on. And when the war was over, their sight returned. And the body does that. You can look it up in the psych books, conversion hysteria. But the rest of the war, we joined the Third Army, which was General Patton. Ultimately, we captured the city of Koblenz, a large city on the Moselle River. And we crossed the river in these little boats, and we went into the town. And street fighting was not something we were used to. Everything else was in open field or in forest. And as I walked through the town, around corners, you can picture this walking in any town, I turned the corner and there was a German soldier with a rifle pointed at me. And this is God's honest truth. I didn't quite know what to do. I hadn't been that close to another human being who was there. And I yelled, "Stick 'em up." Now, you know, you play games as a kid with guns. And the weapon I had at the time had a huge cassette. And it was called, what was it called? A grease gun. It looked like a grease gun, except and I inadvertently pushed the button, which led the cassette to fall to the ground. He ran, literally ran. I picked up the cassette and I realized that the whole thing was ridiculous. That night, we were bunked in a very lovely building, and they captured a number of guys, including this poor soldier. And I went to see, and there he was. He was sure I was going to kill him. I was just glad to be alive at the moment. And that face-to-face as another human being is what really developed the whole philosophy of the lunacy of what I was up to.
Lloyd Conover was in college studying chemistry when the Navy convinced him to change majors. Convincing was easy. Conover was eager to work on the emerging technology called radar if it meant helping his country defeat the Japanese.
So what, did you have any impressions of war when you were growing up? Did you play with Army men or have any family members in the service?
No, I don't think I played with toy soldiers. See, I guess it would have been, it will seem like ancient history to you. I had a great-grandfather who was no longer alive, but who was a Union Army officer in the Civil War. My father was in the Navy in World War I. So had some family connections with people who had been in the military before.
So what I understand is that you went to college for chemistry and then you were asked to change your major. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
In the Navy program that I entered in 1942, the Navy was preparing to have officers for hundreds of ships that were being built or planned to be built, because at that point they had to look forward to both invading Europe and eventually conquering Japan, which would involve an invasion landing craft. So there were hundreds of college students who were offered the opportunity to stay in college, pursuing pretty much what they had been doing before. But when the Navy had officer training schools ready, enough of them, to take these guys to be actually trained as officers, then they stopped their college work. But this was also the time when radar was a brand new thing. It was a wonderful way of being able to see things that far away that you couldn't see. And they thought it would make sense for naval officers to have had a lot of physics. So when I went into that program as a chemistry major, the Navy said, well, we want you to switch to physics.
Okay, so before going into warfare, what was the feeling that you and your peers had that drove you to join service?
The Pearl Harbor attack changed the feeling in the country. Up until that, there was really a big split. President Roosevelt and a lot of people thought that the United States ought to help England, which was holding out alone against Hitler in Europe. But a lot of people thought we should leave the Europeans to fight their wars. It's not our business. And one of the slogans was, America first. The Republican Party was largely what was called an isolationist. But with the attack on Pearl Harbor, there was a dramatic change.
After Hawaii, Conover and his shipmates and a ship full of Marines were sailing on a new LST across the Pacific and toward Okinawa for what would become known as the bloodiest battle of the Pacific. Conover recalls the night he was standing bridge duty during a torpedo attack by a Japanese ship.
Well, there was very little resistance to the first landing at Okinawa.
the Japanese threw a huge number of suicide piloted planes at the U.S. Navy ships that were always there from the beginning of the invasion for months as the battle went on. Literally hundreds of suicide planes came, and I think hundreds of American sailors were killed. We were lucky enough not to be there when the large numbers came over, but we were there when a dozen or so came, and it was rather a surreal picture. They came in as though they were just going to land. They weren't diving, but just glided in and right to ships. But I guess that brings me to one more thing. On the way to the invasion of Luzon in the Philippines, the largest island that the Japanese still had, where we had most of the smaller ones. And I was the officer of the deck, the person in charge for the moment, while the captain was getting some sleep. At night, a Japanese torpedo came right at us. I saw it coming on the left side, the port side. Thought the ship was going to be blowing up. It came out the other side because these LSTs, with their flat bottom and a small depth, didn't extend far enough below the water so that a torpedo set at their normal depth that would hit a proper ship went right under. So my whole story could have been totally different. In that situation, in a convoy on the way to an invasion, if a ship is hit and there are people who would like to be rescued, it is forbidden. They don't stop because they become very vulnerable if the ship stopped and we're just milling around looking for people in the water. So if we had been hit by that torpedo, I probably wouldn't be here today. We were loading troops and we knew this, that we're going to go for the invasion of Japan when the atomic bomb, the first one, was dropped. And that changed the whole future for us, because the invasion of Japan would have, I think, undoubtedly been the, if not the bloodiest battle of World War II, second only to Stalingrad. It would have been millions of people. I mean, it would have been horrible.
For Ralph Waggett, a 16-year-old boy from England, the battle against Germany was personal. He was surrounded by the bombing terror and devastation caused by German air raids. He was determined to join the fight to protect his beloved England.
So I wanted to ask you about your first enlisting into the British Army, because you were 16, right?
16.
16 years old. What was that like, joining at 16? What was the deciding factor?
Well, we British were doing quite well in North Africa, and as a young fellow, I thought, gosh, I want to get in before, it's over. And so I added 2 years to my age. And during grammar school, I had skipped 3 grades. I'm trying to think exactly how old I was when. Oh, when the war started in 1939, Eckerd College is just southeast of London, and the authorities decided that the student body should be evacuated down to Exeter in Devonshire in the West Country to get away from the bombing. And we were all placed with different families. The family I stayed with, the father was a retired regimental sergeant major from the Army, and the son was 19 years of age. He was drafted, and he luckily survived the war. And I was doing very well in my studies, but as I say, in October 1942, when I was 16 and a half, I decided I wanted to get into the war, which is either, I'm not sure if it was foolish or not, but that's what I did. And because I took my academic records, I told the recruiting officer that, you know, my birth certificate had been misplaced, but I had my scholastic records, and he just looked at it and decided anybody that had been in university for a year and a half, you know, had to be at least 18 years of age, so there was no problem there. The British Army, we don't say combat, we call it see in action. So apparently I did quite well, and they made me a corporal, and I was, I don't know how to describe it, but I was leading a small platoon, a small squad one day, and you know, the desert, there's sand dunes, and I've got very good hearing. I could hear some voices, and so, you know, I went like that to my fellows, and I crawled and looked over the top of the sand dune, and about, I estimated it about 400 yards away, there was a German officer who was apparently chewing out. There was 5 or 6 German soldiers with him, and he was pounding his fist like this, so he was obviously giving them a good talking to. And one of my men had a Bren gun, which is a light machine gun, and I told him, I'm going to take the German officer out first, and as soon as I do, then you open up with your Bren gun. And it was an easy shot. It was 400 and some yards, and I shot him through the head. And that was the first German that I killed. And then the Bren gunner took care of the rest of them. And basically, I became more and more confident about, you know, leading other troops.
Okay. What is going through your mind before you're pulling the pins out of grenades? Is it just instinct?
Yes, you really don't have time to think. You're trained to do it, and you really don't have time to think, besides which I was running as fast as I could and throwing them as fast as I could. And for my actions there, I was promoted from corporal to second lieutenant and made a platoon commander.
How many were you in charge of as platoon commander?
Probably around 40 men. And as I say, when we got into Italy, we started coming down with malaria, so they sent us back to Tunisia. And when we were considered, you know, fully fit, instead of being sent back to Italy as we expected to, we were shipped back to England. And then we realized then that we would be taking part in the invasion of Northern Europe. And we trained with not only with the 1st British Airborne, but we had joint maneuvers with the American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions. And it was a young captain by the name of Joe Lovell from the 82nd Airborne, and we became quite friendly, and we both got a 48-hour pass. It was, by this time, of course, we were well into 1944. Becoming a platoon commander, I was given a heavy, what they call a heavy weapon platoon, which had more men, about 48 men, and we had mortars. We also had 3 75mm artillery pieces. Basically, we used them as anti-tank weapons. And on after 2 or 3 false alarms on the night of June the 5th, 1944, we loaded up in our C-47. And the objective that my platoon was given, or the task that we were given, there was a small bridge south of Caen in Normandy. And the bridge would be vital as we, were our line of supply as we advanced towards the east. And this was something that none of us really liked, because the French underground had told us that the bridge was always guarded by 8 Germans, and even at night. And nearby there was quite a large building where the rest of the garrison was. And so our job was to kill the guards without making any noise. So for the first time we had to use knives, and we did it. None of us really liked the idea. It's a lot easier to shoot something than it is to. And of course we were, we blackened our hands and faces, and we synchronized our watches, and we all jumped. And I made a joke, because even though I was the platoon commander, I was the youngest man in the platoon and by far the smallest. And so jokingly I said, this was in the plane before we jumped, I said, well, you fellas take the biggest guards and I'll take the smallest one, because you have to, crawl up slowly behind them and not make any noise, and then jump and grab him around the neck like this so he can't yell, and then you stab him in the back, through the ribs, through the lungs, and up into the heart. And we killed them without them making any noise. And then we could attack the main garrison, which we did with, grenades and sting guns, and killed the rest of the garrison. And moved on, and we were making contact with the British forces that had landed at Sword Beach, and we started hearing rumors about this large operation, which would hopefully shorten the war. And it entailed the use in the 1st British Airborne and both the 82nd and the 101st American Airborne. And in September 1944, it was on a Sunday, the 17th, as I remember. And in broad daylight, we took off from all over the Midlands and the south of England. And we got over the Channel, and standing in the door of the C-47, all you could see was there was just hundreds of planes, pulling gliders, and C-47s, of course, with the paratroopers in. Most of the gliders had the heavy artillery pieces. And our objective was the American objective was to take the bridge at Eindhoven and Nijmegen, and the British were given the honor, if you can call it given the honor, of going the furthest. We were dropped 86 miles behind the lines, and we were to take the bridge at, can we take a break?
On that battlefield that day, like, what did you learn about the human spirit? Like perseverance, fear?
What I learned is that war is crazy. It didn't make any sense. I responded to being called. Everyone else was hiding behind a bush or where they could hide. And my job was to get up and carry a message and tell the platoon leader from such and such a thing to move his troops so such a place, which I did because I was trained and I acted automatically. But as I was doing it, my thought was, this is lunacy, the whole idea. And suddenly the perspective hit me there that if I survived this, it would not be because of anything but luck, because the shells were just falling all around us, men were dying, and it tainted my entire future during the combat experience. I don't know how else I can explain it to you, Sabrina. There was people acted automatically, and the defense systems that you got, my defense system was to do the job and to stay out of the let me give you another way of explaining this. When I read the papers today and I read about troops in Afghanistan going on patrol, I think back to what a patrol really is. A patrol is that you move to find the enemy, who are always in front of you, and they're there wanting to kill you, very simply. It's the same thing that you might feel if I told you that if you walk back to your dormitory now, there is someone between here and there who wants to kill you. And when I realized that, it just didn't make sense anymore.
With regard to the Japanese, I would say they were showing remarkable grit and will to survive under terrible circumstances. And interesting that we encountered no overt antagonism. I think they were apprehensive and frightened, but they believed their emperor. I think, well, as is well known, certainly American troops in the Pacific showed incredible courage and determination, ability to withstand horrible conditions. I think it made me grow up a lot faster. I mean, as I said earlier, the responsibility that someone who would have been a college senior or maybe just out of college found himself in, where you could make a decision that would affect possibly the survival of a lot of other people.
So in the situation like you're in Arnhem, and surviving that ordeal, where do you feel that you fall, either on the side of faith or luck, being a survivor?
Well, my overwhelming feelings about the whole thing was bitterness that 10,000 men were thrown away due to poor planning. Oh, and I should add too that if I didn't, they gave me the Distinguished Service Order, which is, as I say, the second highest award you can get. But and I was even invited in 1947. I was invited to Buckingham Palace, and the King pinned all the medals on my chest. And I had tea with the royal family, and I thought afterwards, didn't make up for the stupidity. May be too strong a word, but poor planning and not listening, because I found out afterwards that several intelligence officers knew that German tanks were in that in the Arnhem area. They had sent over reconnaissance planes, and it showed the tanks clearly. They hid them in along the tree lines, but you could see the photographs. And I actually, after the war, I managed to obtain copies of some of those photographs. And you'd have to be blind not to see they were real tanks. And Montgomery dismissed them as dummy tanks, like we and the Americans used before D-Day. And I don't know if you know this, but in England, of course, the Germans knew the invasion was coming, and they didn't know if it was coming in Normandy or the Pas-de-Calais area. So the British and the Americans manufactured hundreds of dummy tanks out of rubber, inflated rubber tanks. And if you got up close, you could see they were dummies. But from the air, when you're flying at 400 or 500 miles an hour, they probably looked like real tanks. And we were told there was no armored, just second-rate troops in Arnhem. And instead of that, it was two of the finest divisions the Germans had, complete with 86 tanks. And for that, and I should add too another thing, bless their souls, there was, on the Wednesday, the day before I was wounded, the Polish Corps was dropped. And it was a brigade of Polish soldiers. But instead of dropping them on the north side of the Rhine with us, they dropped them on the south side of the Rhine, where they were sitting ducks, and they were killed almost to the last man. So besides losing 10,000 British, with 3,000 Poles were thrown away. Now, how do you explain that? And Montgomery in his memoir said he considered it to be a 90% success. It just boggles the mind. But that's, that's war.
After you guys listened to those stories from Mr. Block, Mr. Conover, and Mr. Waggett, why do you think it is that a lot of military people don't feel comfortable sharing their stories? Let's talk about that. What do you guys think? You can talk now. Why do you think that a lot of military people just feel that need to hold that story in?
It's obviously very emotional to relive those memories, some disturbing and some great memories. They make brotherhoods with a lot of their military members, and then obviously the other ones they don't want to bring that up again because it's so uncomfortable for them to, like I said, relive those memories. So.
Okay, good. Any other thoughts about that?
I was imagining that they might be afraid that people in our situation couldn't possibly understand the way that they felt in those years because we lived such a different life than they lived.
Besides the obvious changes that we know from the Great Depression years and World War II from today, What do you think really has changed? Have a lot of things changed in society and how we look at things or look at war? What do you guys think about that?
I think our awareness of war has changed a lot. They all sounded pretty shocked once they got into warfare, because they were all almost anxious to join the service. It was something to do for their country, but now, we have television, we have internet, we're more exposed to the realities of war, and I think that was something that took them all by surprise, from what I could tell.
Raise your hand if you have a grandparent who ever served in the military. Raise your hand. Almost every one of you. Okay. Raise your hand if you ever asked your grandparent to tell you stories about being in the military. Ooh, the numbers went down a lot, didn't they? Yeah. What's one of the most memorable things for you, Kara, in talking with, was it a grandfather or a grandmother?
My grandfather, he was on the ship, the Astoria, when it sank, and that's like all I really remember. And then I just remember my grandfather telling me that, like, about how he got pneumonia from being in the water and seeing like a lot of people just drown because they're in the water for so long.
Was it difficult for him to tell you those stories, or did it just, what was the setting like one day? Did he just start pouring that story out?
Well, my mom and dad like started asking him questions just because they wanted to know like his experiences, and kind of like what we're doing, we just wanted to like know so we could like remember it. And so we were just sitting at my grandparents' house and talking to him about his life, because it was like right before he passed, and so like he had been sick for a while, so I just wanted to know more about his life.
Okay. Okay, good. Mike, was your hand up too?
It was.
Yeah. Was it a grandfather or a grandmother?
It was my
'Cause,
grandfather.
Believe it or not, there were women in some of the services back then, right? We got to give the women some props. All right, so tell us a little bit about your grandfather.
My grandfather was in the Army and was in Korea and shot howitzers. It was, I don't know, it was interesting to me, like we were talking about a minute ago, how, some of these veterans don't really talk about their stories, that my mom knew that he was in the Army before she was born, in the years leading up to when she was born, but she didn't know that he actually went to Korea for the Korean War. And I remember the first time that I was talking to him about it, I went back to my mom and I said, it's really cool that Grandpa was in the Korean War and he got to shoot howitzers. Like, I didn't know that about him. And she looked at me and said, "What are you talking about?" And it was just, I guess, kind of a sign of the times that it just wasn't really talked about all that much, and my mom just never even knew.
All right, I'm going to try to take you back 2 weeks. Remember that day we were scrambling, we were running around, we were, getting all the pre-production things, the sets all fixed for our veterans. There was this sense of anticipation and nervousness that I felt from you guys. And I remember Ariel in particular said, "I've been nervous all day about this." Ariel, why do you think there was that nervousness?
Oh my gosh, it was just, I've never had the opportunity to do something like that before. I had a family member who was in the military, but I've never heard his story. I didn't even know he was in the military until he passed away. And I was just, it was an anxious, excited feeling. And I was nervous because I just wanted everything to go great, and it did. Everything went smoothly. But I was so excited just to hear everyone's stories and just to get involved with what they had to talk about and what they were saying, and just to see their pictures and just to hear their experiences. But it was definitely a great feeling, and I felt so relieved and so happy that I was able to participate in something like this.
Okay. Who else was really nervous that day or leading up to it? Geraldine, where do you think the nerves came from?
I guess really, I was just so excited to hear their stories, but I knew that it was going to be hard for them. Both of my grandfathers were in World War II, and one of them passed away before I was born, and one of them passed away when I was 6 months old. So I never even had the opportunity to ask. And when I asked my mom, she didn't really know anything until he died and found all of his medals. And that's so incredible that we never really knew the story of Bumpa. We never really learned what he did. We knew he was a bombardier, and that was about it. we thought he had one Purple Heart, he had two. Like, it's just.
Okay, let me ask you this. Let's talk a little bit about what we heard that night. Let's talk a little bit about one of the stories that you remember hearing that really, really stands out to you.
Yeah, I think the part of Len Block's interview that really struck me, as it was really to me the most intense part of his interview, was when he was talking about his job when he finally got into really serious action. And he was a message runner, so he would run messages between, different leaders and back and forth between different areas of the battlefield. And he talked about at one point when they were in combat and they were being shot at and everything like that. Everybody around him was hiding behind bushes and trees and little holes in the ground that they had dug and rocks and everything else. And he remembers hearing "runner," which was his symbol, his signal to get up and go do his job. And he said that it was instinct to him just to get up and run to where he needed to be. And he finally got a chance to sit down after that and thought, like, why is anyone doing this? This is absolutely crazy. People are getting shot at. They are shooting at me, and he's just running back and forth, in the line of fire. And he said, I think he said he knew that the only way he was going to survive the war was through sheer luck, because there was shells landing all around him, bullets whizzing by, and he knew that it was just pure luck that was going to get him through. And that was really, really powerful to me.
I like how you brought that up, because that kind of segues into the next thing I was going to talk about. Remember, one of the questions that our interviewers asked our World War II veterans was, where were they on the side of faith or fate versus luck? And he very clearly identified that as having been luck, right? Did you guys get any other impression from the veterans about how faith or fate or any of that kind of entered in for them in combat?
I don't know necessarily about faith or fate or luck or any of that, but I know our last interview, he just was wondering what more he could have done. And that's not necessarily fate or luck or any of that, but what a single person can do for so many people. And I think that's really what we were doing that night, was just trying to get that story of how one small group of people did so much for not just our country, but for the world. And there's no fate or faith or luck in any of that. It's just hard work and war.
Let's talk a little bit about this provocative statement that has stayed with me for 2 weeks now. Think back to this moment. There were a bunch of us in the room, and Sabrina was interviewing Len Block. And she asked him, what was it like to be in combat? Do you remember that question, for those of you who were in the room? And Mr. Block gave this, what I call, a very provocative answer. He said, okay, Sabrina, imagine that you're walking from here back to your dorm room. And from here to your dorm room, there's somebody out there whose job it is to kill you. There's somebody out there trying to kill you. That was pretty profound, wasn't it? Because you could all, I'm sure, imagine walking back to your dorm room that night. How did that strike you guys when you heard that? What went through your mind? Who was in the room that night and heard that part? Yeah. Okay. Alex, how was that for you?
I think it puts in perspective just the total lucracy of war, and like how crazy it is for strangers to be killing each other. I remember he was talking about, he was walking through some city and there was a guy just around the corner who wanted to kill him, and something happened, and I guess someone came behind him and was going to shoot the other guy. But it's just so strange, and I think in part that may be why it's hard to talk about, because in the civilian world there's not, like, strangers don't just kill each other, and so, especially for someone who has killed, that's not really something that is quite easy to discuss with people who haven't experienced that.
Can I talk about that story he told with the German around the corner? Because I thought that best illustrated how everyone in the war was so scared. Because what I remember him saying is that he came around the corner and pointed his rifle at a German soldier who also had his rifle pointed at Mr. Block. And Mr. Block's magazine clip fell out of his gun because he pushed the wrong switch or something. And, excuse me, the German soldier was so scared that he dropped his gun and fled. And I think that, I don't know how old Mr. Block said he was at the time, but these were really just a bunch of kids out there. They weren't hardened criminals. And that German soldier who stared him in the face that day probably didn't harbor much ill will to him on a humanity level. He probably didn't hate Mr. Block, and he probably didn't even want to kill Mr. Block, except that that's what he was trained to do on an instinct level. And when it came time to pull the trigger, I don't think he wanted to do it. And I don't think any of us would, really.
Okay, let's talk about a few more of these stories that we heard that night that we found so interesting. Amy, I want to start with you. You were interviewing Mr. Ralph Waggett, right? Now, Mr. Waggett had been in the British Army, right?
Yes.
And he had joined the service at 16, if I remember right.
Right.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting that during our interview with Mr. Waggett, he was probably of the three the most stony-faced, wouldn't you say? And then Amy throws him that question about what did you learn about the human spirit during combat? What happened? What happened to Mr. Waggett at that point? Did he change? Amy?
It was really when we were talking, I think, about the numbers that they lost that day, and then the orders that they were given, and there was nothing really he could do. He was a corporal at that point, so he was in charge of all these people who having to give this order that they had to do this, knowing that they were going to lose people. And it was really, we were leaving, and I was walking him out the door when he said to me that war is so stupid, and he was crying. And it was at that point when it, I wish that was on camera too, but it really got to him.
Yeah.
And I was not expecting it at all, for him to state that bitterness about the war and about the orders that they were given. And looking back on it, I think he's had time to reflect and realize that what war in general, what has been done to them, was so outside of themselves and just as stupid.
I know.
Senseless.
Let's talk a little bit about Mr. Conover. Now, Mr. Conover was in the Navy, right? And he was on a ship during the invasion of Okinawa. And if you'll remember from some of the things we've talked about and researched a little bit as we were preparing for this, the Okinawa battle was the bloodiest battle in the Pacific. And I don't know if you guys know this story, but the Japanese were so afraid of Americans, especially American Marines, that the Japanese men insisted that every Okinawan woman jump off the cliffs when it was apparent and obvious that the Marines had won the island and were coming ashore. Because they thought that every Marine would basically rape every Okinawan woman. So they were throwing the women off the cliffs, and the women were forced to throw their babies off the cliffs and into the South China Sea. Can you imagine standing up there? And those women who were too afraid to throw their babies out into the sea were thrown over the cliffs by their uncles or their cousins or their brothers in an effort to have them save face. That was very, very important for those people in a sense of wanting to be able to save face. So here we have, kind of knowing what that story is. And so here we have the Marines coming ashore. We have Mr. Conover, who's on a Navy ship there for the invasion. Tell me a story that you particularly remember that Mr. Conover shared.
I was in the room for that one, though.
The one about the torpedo?
Yeah, I'll jump on that one.
Okay.
One thing that I think is really great about talking to a person of a certain age is you can tell when they're getting excited about something because they start talking with their hands. And he periodically would get into these fits where he would just use his hands for everything he was talking about. That was one of the instances where he said that their ship in particular was a new style, so that it was a flat bottom, and they had sent the torpedo to hit exactly where it would have been had it been a normal ship. and he was just, using the motions and like saying that everything was around him. It was pretty incredible. And then what he ended up saying was that, his story could be a lot different had it not been for that. And that was what really hit me, was like, wow, he would have been on a different ship. He wouldn't be there to tell us this story.
Mia, tell us a little bit about how that evening shaped you. How did it affect you?
Well, not being an American and from a completely different nation, a very small country, going in, I had no idea what to expect, what I was going to hear. And Block really gave me a better understanding of what it's like. I know not many of us have heard stories, but I just really didn't know what to expect, and it was just all kind of overwhelming, even though, not being from this country and having not much knowledge of what going to war is like. I just couldn't get over how young they are going into war, not even our age. And that was the hardest part for me, understanding how to defend a whole country being so young.
Raise your hand if you know somebody who has either served in Iraq or Afghanistan or is serving. Raise your hand. Geraldine, tell us who you know.
My cousin Chucky. He's in the Air Force, and he just served 3 tours in either Qatar, Afghanistan, or Iraq. I think he did 1 in each.
Mike, who do you know?
I come from an area in Georgia where there's a lot of military presence. So, I know a friend of mine, Blake, who's in the Army, a couple of friends, Brendan and Gray, who were in the Marines. Derek was in the Marines. I've got, a bunch of friends who have all served.
Aaron, did I see your hand go up? Do you know somebody who has either been in Iraq or Afghanistan or is there?
Yeah, one of my buddies from middle school who, he was from Alabama. He wasn't from Austin, but obviously, where he was from, it's much more kind of like my grade, much more military-minded families.
You were also young when 9/11 happened. How old were you?
4th or 5th grade.
4th or 5th grade. So you're, what, 9 or 10?
Yeah.
11?
15.
15? Oh, that's right. You're the old man of the group. Okay. 15. I'm sure you've heard the stories that after 9/11 happened, the military recruiting stations were pretty flooded. Probably with the same level of fervor as what happened in World War II after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Right? Think about the attack we just had in Boston last night. 3 are confirmed dead. They're saying now more than 200 people are injured. I'm sure you've seen the horrific photographs of people who've lost limbs. Very war zone-like. In fact, the doctors at the emergency rooms have said these are not typical injuries. These are war-like injuries that we see. Did you guys think about that when you heard that? And about these stories? Anything you can expand on that? Randy?
Well, I don't know. I remember as a kid, 9/11, they had started broadcasting it on the news shortly after we got to school, and I was one of the few kids whose parents didn't pick them up, so I spent the whole day at school just watching rerun after it, and I saw horrendous things on the TV, but I didn't fully comprehend it. I just saw it as news. And I saw it yesterday. I walked into someone's room and it was on the TV, and my heart just dropped in a sense that, they don't know who did it, but whoever did it, the fact that people are willing to do that to each other, that I guess I didn't really value my security as an American when I was younger, but the fact that we can have gatherings of people from all over the world in a city and can shut down an entire city just to gather together, and the fact that people are doing things to make us question the safety of that, and my perspective on it has completely changed because I see it as a relationship to other people rather than news now. I just see it as we're being questioned on whether to trust one another, and I think that's something that we should never have to do. And it's very painful. That whole LSC Cy Fair stabbing that happened, at the college. That was the school I used to go to, and I have friends who sat next to that kid in class every day, and they just thank God that they're still alive, that they weren't attacked by this person who they assumed they could trust. And that's what it really hits me with, is that we have to, you have to almost question who you trust, and I don't think that's something we should have to do.
I think it's different with our generation because the motives for the wars that we're fighting right now are not as clear-cut and not as universally agreed upon as World War II was. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, that most people, or at least the majority of the people in America, were hesitant to get involved in Europe's war until Pearl Harbor happened. And that's why we didn't jump right in at the onset of World War II. And sometimes it takes a terrible tragedy like that to make people feel vulnerable and afraid, and the response is anger and hatred and violence and war. And I think that's the saddest part of it, is that sometimes things like this can't pass without a war. There had to be a war after 9/11. It had to happen, and I wish it didn't.
Every day, America loses more of its World War II veterans. Soon, they will all be gone, and gone with them their stories. Most of their stories never even told during their lifetime. They had returned from the atrocities of war in Europe and in the Far East and found they had to fight their way out of the Great Depression. Still, it is hard to imagine a world in which no one from that greatest generation is still living among us. Perhaps a granddaughter will discover a legacy among a pile of crumbling letters in an old shoebox at the back of a closet, or fish a Purple Heart from an old army sock at the bottom of an attic chest. Maybe years from now, a great-grandson will find the tri-folded American flag and wonder about the man whose very DNA courses through his veins. Abraham Lincoln said, "Any nation that does not honor its heroes will not long endure." We never asked Leonard Block, Lloyd Conover, or Ralph Waggett whether they saw themselves as heroes, probably because we knew, looking back now, that they'd scoff at that. We knew they'd talk instead about the others, about their friends, their buddies, about their men who didn't make it back, about the ones still buried under foreign soil. But one evening, a group of Eckerd College journalism students sat huddled around 3 World War II veterans in the shadow of 3 unmistakable heroes and realized they were all forever changed. Do we think of Mr. Block, Mr. Conover, and Mr. Waggett, our 3 World War II veterans, do we think of them as heroes? Do we? Bobby, do you think of them as heroes?
I mean, yeah, I do. I think so.
I think hands down, anybody who's willing to sacrifice themselves for their country like that needs to be considered a hero.
Do we throw that word out there too lightly?
I think we do. I mean, we're lucky that we even have a choice not to serve in the military.